والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. My name is Sami, and this speaker, Brother Abdullah from the Lyceum. We would like to welcome you to our second event. Today's talk is supposed to be a debate between us and the Atheist Society, but unfortunately we couldn't have it. But inshallah we will present our perspective, Islamic perspective on the topic, does God exist? And the program outline will be something like this. I would introduce Brother Abdullah, and then he would give his talk for about 20 minutes, 20 to 25 minutes, and then inshallah we'll have a questions and answer session in which you can ask questions inshallah. So Brother Abdullah is from Portugal, but he was born in the United Kingdom, and he has been a Christian before when he was a teenager, and he has been studying Islam since the age of 18, I believe. He has studied and explored many other religions before he accepted the religion of Islam, and he has a long experience of working in the Muslim community, and his activities involve writing and talking extensively on Islamic philosophy, sociology, and anthropology. He has delivered talks throughout the United Kingdom at community centers, universities, colleges, and also appeared on TV programs as well. And one of his appearances on a TV program was on theology, current affairs, and political analysis. He has also been involved and still is involved in debates with different organizations, different religious societies and school of thoughts, and Christians, atheists, on a variety of topics. So inshallah he is well known. He is currently a member of the Muslim Debate Initiative, which is a public discussion forum that promotes open dialogue and debate. So inshallah, without further delay, I'd like to pass it on back to Brother Abdullah.
Hello? So it should be right. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salamu ala Nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi at-tayyibin wa sahbihi as-salihin. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Islamic Society of Southampton University for inviting me to this very interesting discussion for their Islam Awareness Week on the proof of God. Originally, I had prepared for a debate. It's very unfortunate that the atheist speaker pulled out. But what I'd like to do with this is to present to you the arguments for why we believe in God, and inshallah I will present you some of the counter arguments, and we'll discuss those counter arguments. And inshallah, if any atheists in the audience, or even Muslims who would like to play devil's advocate during the questions and answers, I would please invite you to try to poke holes in this, because in the presentation, because it's very important that we have whatever we believe in, we have a very cast iron solid certainty about what we hold as truth. Now, the proof of God, people expect that argument to be very philosophical. You have to be some kind of theologian, advanced scholar to discuss this. But in reality, it's extremely simple. Even a child understands it, and a child will normally come to it naturally through their own contemplation and thinking. it's similar to the story in the Quran about Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, who went around trying to find which was the real God to worship, and he forsook the idols that his parents told him to worship, and he thought maybe it's the sun, because the sun everything seems to depend on the sun. And when the sun went down, he saw, well, the sun is limited by the night, and so the sun can't be God. So then he thought maybe it's the moon, and again he saw the moon basically descend, and it became day again. He realized, oh, then it can't be the moon because the moon is limited. So he came to the conclusion that wherever the reality is, whatever created everything, is neither the sun or the moon or anything that he could see. It was a force beyond this. And so he came to it very, very easily, very rationally. Now, when a child asks the question, where do babies come from? It's very interesting. It might seem a very innocuous, innocent question to ask. Where do babies come from? What's it got to do with God? But you see, the child hasn't seen babies be created. The child hasn't seen it. The child just sees the baby there. When it wonders to itself, well, where did it come from? Where did these things come from? And so naturally, the human mind always asks where things come from, where things which seem to be in a certain shape or a certain size or a certain color or a certain degree or dimension. What defined these things? What defined the parameters of these things? What shaped it? What gave it its color? What gave it its size, dimension, its weight, and so on and so forth? It's very natural. It's a natural process of human thinking. And even so, when you tell a child that God created everything in the universe, normally a child would accept and then think about it and realize that, okay, that seems pretty reasonable theory. And essentially what you're telling the child is that there's nothing in this universe which is God, but there is something beyond this universe which is God. And interesting enough, when, for example, some of the atheist contentions is that people used to worship the sun, or they used to worship a volcano if they were an island, or a volcano on the island, or they used to worship other human beings or statues and so on. They thought this is all silly because these objects can't help you. They are part of the material universe. So when we posit the correct understanding, or a more enlightened understanding, we say, well, okay, very quite simple. The force that created this universe is not in this universe. Let's just be like, that makes more sense. The atheists will say, oh, but how can we believe something we can't see? So you can't win, generally, in terms of the arguments brought up by a lot of the neo-atheists, because they say, if you worship something in this universe, they say it's part of the material universe where you're worshipping it. If you worship outside this universe, they say, how can you worship something you can't see? So inshallah, it is because that atheists like Richard Dawkins and others, philosophers, who advanced these logics forward to try to counterattack against a very simple, basic argument of proof of God, that inshallah we have to now respond with a deeper and profound understanding of proof of God to explain to people that have been confused by use of logic games to justify why they should believe in a God. And there are reasons why they want to reject God, and it's not because of lack of rational evidence, it's for other reasons. A lot of them are emotional reasons, but inshallah we'll get to that. First, before I come to anything, I'd like to ask a question. How do we know reality exists? How do we know that what you're seeing doesn't exist? It's just some kind of an imagination, or you're in the Matrix, or whatever that you've probably heard this argument before. How do we know that it exists? Well, a reasonable person would conclude that there is an external world to yourself which is beyond your control. There is something that, wherever you're seeing, even if it's an illusion, even if you're in the Matrix, quote unquote the Matrix, there is an external world to you which is not yourself. And you are receiving sensations from this external world which you can't control. Therefore, there exists an external world outside of yourself. Makes sense. People say, oh, but how do we know we're not in the Matrix? I say, it's irrelevant. Because even if we are in the Matrix has a reality to it. It's a computer program based on the computer, but there is a cause. It has some kind of an existence. There is an existence, but you're just in the Matrix. But wherever it is, it exists. There is an existence for it. Even when you dream, the existence of your dream comes from your subconscious, comes from your mind, comes from your brain cells. So there is a cause to what you see in your dream as well. So there's always a cause. This is the reasonable way of thinking. This is what we call rational thinking when we look at these things and we make these conclusions. So that's how we know for certain there's an external reality to ourselves. Now, what method are we going to use to observe this reality? What method are we going to use to understand? In philosophy they call it epistemology, which I think most of us probably haven't heard before. Epistemology means how you know something is true, or how you find the truth, how you investigate. Well, I would like to propose there are 3 ways that we can investigate the reality. There is one of them is called logic, other one's called the empirical thought only, or the scientific method, you know it as only, or rational thought. I'll start with logic. Logic, people use this word thinking, isn't rational thought and logic the same thing? Well, they're not. Logic is a system developed by the Greeks to try to correct errors in their thinking and to try to produce thoughts based on what they thought was evidence. And how it works is you have premise A, premise B leads to premise C. So, for example, just giving you one example. If the postman delivers your letters, you receive letters in your box. Therefore, if you have received letters on any particular day, the postman has delivered those letters. It's simple, it's premise, premise, conclusion. And that might sound alright, that might sound, yeah, fine, you know, there we go. But it doesn't always work. Because what if your neighbor got your letter by accident and then decided to deliver it into your letterbox? Logic says that only the postman does this. Your logic will tell you that the only answer for that is the postman. You say, no, there could be other possibilities. And logic is very narrow. It's based on assumptions. I could say, and I'll give you a classic example, I could say wings convey the ability to fly. Penguins have wings. Therefore, penguins have the ability to fly. We know that's fallacious, it's incorrect, but it's logical, it makes logical sense. And of course, I know that anyone here who studied logic will say, but we've categorized things called logical fallacies, which will, like for example, category error or false attribution error, which we can check our premises. And say, that's all fine, but why do you have to make the mistakes in the first place, then check it afterwards? Why not come to the correct conclusions first time round? Because you're only going to confuse yourself. And I will guarantee every single fallacy on the face of this earth, every single false belief or idea or creed has been justified by its own logic. I'll guarantee it. Every single creed, even the creed, even on completely absurd creeds, such as the Earth is flat. Why? Well, we see that the land is flat, therefore the Earth is flat. That was justified using logic. So I show that logic is not the best method of thought. What about the scientific method, what we call the empiricism? Well, it does give us some facts, yes, scientific method is useful and it has its place, but it has limitations. It is only limited to tangible, material objects. It can't be used on immaterial things. And you might think, what is immaterial? Well, according to science, poetry, art, music, literature, language, the human mind, and even personality doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. Art doesn't exist, music doesn't exist, the human mind doesn't exist. Language itself doesn't exist. Yes, the ink on the paper exists, but not language. Why? Because it's intangible. Can't be measured. Can't be empirically categorized or understood or detected. So science is useful. Science is useful for detecting, obviously, the universe, atoms, protons, electrons, and so on. Yeah, it's useful for tangible things, but not intangible things, which we know exist. Obviously, our mind detects that exists, the intangible. And also, that science already presupposes another way of thinking, which is it assumes that the external world, or what you see in your experiment, is true. The external world exists, and what you observe from it is true, and that the laws of the universe you discover in your laboratory are operative in everywhere else in the universe, not just in your laboratory. You're making that's an assumption. You assume that if the atom behaves in a certain way in your laboratory, it behaves the same way every other area in this universe. And so that's an assumption. You can't prove that empirically. And so science needs something else to underpin it. It is very useful, but it's limited to a certain way. And as I said before, our science does not answer why. It only answers how. So you have to know where to use it. So then those two ways of thinking aren't the best way before we proceed. the best to discuss proof of God, the best way of thinking is what I call rational thought. And what is rational thinking? You hear this word a lot. What does it mean? Well, it's very simple. It just means thought based on observation of the external reality. It means that you make no assumptions due to previous experience. You let the reality itself that you observe tell you what the reality is. Let it define for you. So when you encounter a penguin for the first time, just because it has wings, and don't assume it flies, say, all right, well, okay, it has what it looks like to be wings, and they seem to be wings, but it may not necessarily mean that it can fly. Let me see if I can detect that through various ways and means. And of course, the third point of rational thought is it believes in causality of finite objects, basically meaning that there is cause and effect. That's how you know there's an external world, because you're receiving sensation, which means there is an external world outside your control. That's cause and effect. It's natural way of human thinking, inshallah. There are chairs in the front if anyone wants to come sit in the front, inshallah. So, for example, if a person plants a seed in one area of ground, in some dry area, and then plants a seed in another area of ground which is a bit more moist, and they observe that the plant grows better in the moist, we can conclude generally that there is something about that area, whatever it might be. I'm not going to say the moisture, it might not be an assumption, but there's something about that area of ground which is more conducive to the seed growing. And then inshallah, with maybe scientific experiment, you can determine is it the moist that's giving it, or the nutrients that's giving it? What is the causal factor? If you say it's moist, that's an assumption. But you can conclude that that area of land is better for the seed. That is a rational observation, and it's cause and effect. So that the seed grows better, therefore it must be a reason why it's growing better in that area of land. It's a reason, it's a cause to it. Cause and effect. Rational observation, rational thought. Anyone that denies cause and effect, you're basically throwing out human thinking altogether. You might as well believe in anything. You might as well believe unicorns just pop into existence spontaneously, because that's pretty much the same thing if you deny cause and effect. So there are, and I'm also going to mention what is the prerequisite to rational thought. The prerequisites to rational thought are obviously that you perceive something, you have perception, you possess a mind that can interpret what you perceive, and obviously you possess memory and understanding, i.e. the previous information you have, so you can link what you see with what you possess in your mind to understand something. So if you show me a chair, I've seen many types of chairs, and I know they're called chairs. When I see a new type of chair, I can identify it's still a chair, even though it's the first time I've seen it based on my previous information. So that's how thinking is. You can read a book, and sometimes, if you're very in a hurry, and I'm going to read the last page quickly, and you kind of scramble through it, but you don't actually read it. You don't, and you ask about it, you don't know what how it actually ended, or that chapter, because you weren't thinking about it when you're reading it. You were just reading it. And so when you read, you actually think, because you're connecting the information with your previous information to actually imagine the concept the book is trying to teach you, or the story is trying to give you in your mind. So this is rational thought. So I put forward that rational thought is the way we go ahead with looking at the proof of God. Now, in a way, the proof of God is identical to how I proved reality. Identical. It's the same. It's all the same. It's always the same. In a way, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God, our conception of God, if you're Muslim, is called al-haq, which obviously derives from the word waqiyah, which is reality or truth. So the proof of reality, proof of God, I like to see that they're very much the same thing, because we believe, I believe my conception, that God is the ultimate reality. Now, the first proof of God is what I call the cosmological argument, or I'll put the causality argument. Now, I know you've heard all these fancy words for it. I'm not going to give you a lot of jargon. I'm going to give you some practical understandings so that we can actually take it from here and actually say it to others and understand it. Basically, in a nutshell, the causality argument is very simple. If I just take any object, now, if I take this bottle, for example, I wish I had a rock here, because the atheists might accuse me of the design argument. If I had a rock, I could do the same thing. This bottle, how do we know it's created? Obviously, the atheists could answer, oh, well, I've seen bottles like this being made in factories, ergo, because I've seen it, I know it's been created. I said, well, firstly, you haven't seen this particular bottle being created in the factory, but if I wish I had a rock, I would hold it up and say, how do you know this rock is created? Have you seen the rock?
that particular rock being created? You don't even know if it came from Earth, or it was from a meteorite. If it came from a meteorite, how do you know it hasn't always existed? They couldn't answer because they use the empirical method of thinking, the scientific method, which means you have to observe it to know it's true. Whereas rational method, it's just the reasonable way of thinking is, I know it's created very simply because it has limits. It is a certain shape, a certain color, a certain weight, a certain density, has certain parameters to itself. The question is, why does it have the limits that it has? Why does this bottle have these limits? Why not twice as big, or half as big, or orange color, or a red color? Why blue color, for example? And why does it have what appears to be water in it? Why does it not have orange juice or something else? Why is that? Naturally, we conclude that, well, the bottle didn't give itself these attributes because the bottle didn't create itself. That's absurd. So the only conclusion is that it was made by something else. I'm not going to say it was made by humans, or I'm not going to say what made it. I'm only going to conclude for the time being that it was made by something else. Why? Because it's limited. It's finite. And therefore we say it is dependent. It depends on other things to cause it. So what do we see in general with all finite objects? I use the word finite for a reason. Finite objects, they exist within parameters. So they exist within a parameter. They have attributes that define it, which could be that its texture, its mass, what it's made of, the nature of what it's made of. It exerts a force on other objects to a finite degree. So it interacts with my hand. And it interacts with my hand in a certain way. It exerts a force. If I throw it, it has a certain weight. If I want to move it to one place to another. And of course, it is subject to cause and effect. And as it limits the present, it limits and is limited by other objects, which obviously the fact that this object exists means that there is an absence of the air in the general atmosphere in this room, in this object. The air in this room cannot enter this object, and this air and this object has created a displacement of air in this room. For example, you know, if you put like when you're playing in your bathtub with a big ship or whatever, and you pushed it down, you noticed that maybe the water went just a little bit higher because it limits the water, and the water limits the ship. So it interacts with other objects. So it's limited, and a clever person in the audience has already now seen where I'm going with this, and I've really proven God exists because the universe itself is made up of finite things, finite objects, finite space, finite time. Time proceeds down a finite and discrete amount of points, which I guess the current scientists call Planck time, which is the smallest unit of time, and of course Planck space, the smallest unit of space. But you don't need science to tell you that. Someone could say to you, how do you know the universe is finite? How do you know it's not infinite? But we're just seeing it we're just in a small portion of this big infinite expanse. Number of reasons. One reason is that in an infinite universe, the distance between any 2 points is infinite. A to B, in an infinite universe, any 2 points is infinite. The fact that we can move in this universe shows that the universe is not infinite, it is finite. And if the universe was infinite, then it can't be made up of components. Because if it's made up of components, if you have an infinite amount of let's say bottles, for example, then they would all limit each other out of existence. They would you can't have infinite amount of separate things because they would all limit each other. You couldn't have this. It's like I guess you can imagine an infinite amount of balloons. Even if you give them infinite space, they'd limit each other out. They couldn't have all find a space to exist if there are infinite amount of them. So we know that also the universe is governed by universal laws, which again is it's merely the interaction of finite things in this universe. Now again, I don't need to get too scientific because I want to keep it very basic so that it's a very practical argument. The universe consists of finite things, each relating to each other in a finite way, in a limited way, and of course the universe itself has a limited size. We know this because we can move. Also, the universe changes in time. The universe changes. If the universe was infinite or eternal, then it would require an infinite amount of changes to get to this point in time. Is it possible to transverse infinity? Can you actually reach from infinity to point X? Could you actually reach point X? You can't. It will take an infinite amount of time. You never reach it, i.e. it's impossible. It would be impossible. So the fact that you have change shows there must have been not an infinite regress, but it must have started at one point in time. I guess to give you an analogy to make it make sense, imagine I had an infinite domino rally. You know what domino rallies, right? An infinite domino rally in both directions. And you saw the dominoes were coming into your room, for example, and they were hitting each other. They're moving into your room and they're hitting each other. If it took an infinite amount of dominoes for it to reach the room where part of domino rally is, would it ever reach your room? If it took an infinite amount of dominoes to get there, it can't, because you can't exhaust infinity. So the fact that we see dominoes moving, we know that there must have been at some point a start point. I don't know how long it was. I don't know how far it was, but it was at some point there was a start point to the domino rally. Likewise, the universe itself is, because it's changing, it must have had a start point. Just as the dominoes were hitting each other, likewise the universe itself had a start point by which it was created and it started to change, and it's reached this current point in time of its changes. So in a way, this is already the proof from observation of the universe that there is already a start point to the universe. The universe was created at some point. I'm not saying how big the universe is. I'm not saying how old the universe is. That we need science to look at that. All I'm saying, at some point, at some time, it was started. It was created. So what do we see? I will give you another angle now. Another angle to look at. Let's take the bottle again. As I said, I wish I had a rock, because the atheist would say, oh, but again, you're using the design argument with human-made objects. So say, okay, fine, I can use a rock. I wish I had a rock. Imagine it's a rock then. Use your imagination. Let's say this is the rock. Okay, we have three options for this bottle rock for how you explain its existence. Option one, it made itself. Option two, it is uncreated. It was never created. It was never created. It just always has existed. And option three, it was created by something else. Only those three possibilities. Nothing more than that. Can't be anything more. There's no fourth one. If there is, please say it. But there's nothing more than those three possibilities. Let's look at the first possibility. The object made itself. It's absurd because you have to exist in order to do something. So the object has to exist to make itself. And if it didn't exist prior to it being existing, can't make itself. It's absurd. You could say the second option is maybe the object has always been here. Maybe the object was never created. Okay, but here's a question. Why does it have the certain size it has? Why does it have the shape, the color, the texture, the nature it has? Why has it not existed from infinity, doubled its size, or half its size, or a different color, or a different shape? Why from all infinity, all eternity, it has been this particular shape, with this particular color, and this particular mass, particular nature? See, it doesn't make sense, because it has limits. So the question is, what gave it those limits? What's decided that it should have those limits, or what natural process, you call it, gave it the limitations it has? If it has never been created, if this depended on nothing to limit it, why is it limited? So again, that option two falls down. I could use another example. I am going to use another example to further kind of clarify in your mind. Imagine someone said, you saw a pond, okay, you saw a pond, you didn't see how deep it was. And someone said to you, that pond is infinitely deep. And the water is infinite. Now imagine this 2,000 years ago, before we knew about the Earth was a sphere of a certain size. 2,000 years ago, when someone said this pond is infinitely deep and has infinite amount of water. And you might say, oh, fine. But why does it reach only that particular water level? Why doesn't it go beyond that water level? Or it's shorter than that water level? Why that particular water level? If it's an infinite amount of water, why does it stop there? Why does it end there? It doesn't make sense. So even though you didn't, as a scientist, as an empiricist would do, they'd have to say, well, let me dive in and see if I can find the bottom. A rationalist wouldn't need to do that. A rational thinker would say, well, no, I can conclude, I don't know how deep it is, but I know it has a bottom somewhere, because the water is only going up to a certain level. So I know now that option two, this object, this rock, was not always existent, it was not eternal, it was not uncreated. There's only one possibility left. It was caused by something else. That's the only option left. Alright, someone might say, and an atheist might say, although generally now they've stopped using this argument because they realize the fallacy. They might say, okay, maybe it's, okay, fine, this universe was created. Alright, fine, I'll concede that. But how do you know it wasn't created by another universe, that was created by another universe, that was created by another universe, ad infinitum, for forming this infinite chain of created universes. Again, the domino analogy is the same thing. You still fall foul of the analogy I gave, the domino analogy. When imagine one domino is a universe, and to exist it has to be hit by the previous domino behind it, and that has to be hit by the previous domino behind that, so on and so forth. If you had an infinite rally of dominoes, would any of them ever fall down? No. Infinite regress is irrational. The term for believing in an infinite chain of causality is called infinite regress. And again, that's irrational, it's absurd. I can give another example, I think another example just to kind of clarify in your minds. Let's say that there is an infinite amount of poor people. An infinite amount of poor people. We have no money at all between us. I want £1. So I ask the brother here, if you can give me £1, and so on. And he doesn't have £1, so he asks that brother over there, in the red top, yeah, I'm talking about you. Oh no, spotlight. Alright, and then he doesn't have any money, so he asks the other brother next to him, and he asks the other brother next to him, the other brother next to him, and they all had no money. No matter how far you go back, no matter how many people you ask of infinite poor, you can ask an infinite amount of poor people. If they don't have £1, it doesn't matter how many you have, no one will ever get £1. And therefore, how can you now say that this universe depends on an infinite amount of universes prior to it creating it, when each of these universes themselves are dependent on something else to create themselves? It's like saying infinite amount of nothing. It's the same. It doesn't make rational sense to say that. So, the only thing that we are left with is to conclude there was a start point to the creation of existence. And again, I'm not saying how big the universe is, I'm not saying how old it is, or maybe there are bigger shells of there are bigger different shells of universes beyond this universe that we haven't seen yet. Fine, I accept that, maybe. I'm not limiting it. I haven't seen it, I haven't used science to detect it. But there is an end point. That's what I'm saying, or a start point basically, where it begins. Now, I'll give the last atheist contention just so that you're fully grounded for any possible argument. They might say, get really clever and say, maybe it's a loop. Maybe this universe depends on another universe, that goes all the way around and loops in on itself. Aha, that will confuse you. I say, well, no, because you're saying the same thing as infinite regress. You're saying that basically there is a whole bunch of universes which each depend on something else to exist. They intrinsically can't self-subsist, as in they intrinsically can't exist internally. They depend on something else to create them. And so you're having a loop of nothing. Or to put it another way, again, if a whole bunch of poor people formed a little chain of people, and I asked £1, and I asked pound, and none of us had a £1, no matter if you looped it together, would you get any pound? Again, the argument is also fallacious. It's irrational, it doesn't work. So, after all this, looking at these examples, I think you're starting to see now there has to be a start point. Now, the atheist might say, alright, fine, I concede that as well. But, if you say it's God, who created God? Aha, I've got you there. And I say, what was my premise of all my arguments? I said anything that is finite is created and had a start point. Anything that's finite, limited. The only way you can solve the equation, this problem, is at some point to say that there is something that is not finite, and this something is not limited, and not dependent on anything else. That's the only thing you can say to actually reach an end point to your investigation. So whatever this thing is, I'm not going to give it a name now, I'm not going to give it a name. Whatever this thing is, there is something out there which is infinite, unlimited, and independent. And it caused the finite, limited, and dependent things to exist. That's all I'm saying. But interestingly enough, if you think about it, if a finite, limited thing there's nothing about a finite, limited thing that requires it to exist, i.e. this bottle, there's nothing about this bottle that requires it to exist. It is dependent on something else to define it, to cause it to exist. So we know that this bottle is dependent on something else to make it. Likewise, this thing that we've detected using our rational thinking, we know it is infinite and unlimited and independent. So it is not subject to causality itself. So nothing can affect it. Nothing can make it change. In fact, it can't change because as we know, if something changes, then it must have had a start point. So this thing cannot be affected by anything else outside itself. This infinite thing that we've rationally detected with our minds. So then, if this thing created the finite objects, why did it do that? If nothing made it do it. You see, if nothing made it do it, why did it do that? The only possibility we can conclude is because it wanted to. That's the only conclusion we can find. And if it wanted to, then it has a will. How odd. It has a will. This infinite powerful thing, whatever it is, has a will. Because nothing can force it to do anything because it has no limitations. It can't be interacted with, as in you can't affect it or change it. So it must have a will then, if it to literally decide to create finite things. Because it does not depend on finite things to exist. So if it made us, it's because it wanted to. Now that concludes, in a nutshell, what we call the cosmological argument or the causality argument. There's not an argument which is the teleological argument, which is basically the argument from design. Now again, the atheist gets emboldened and says, "All right, okay, I can refute you guys on this one. The design argument, I can prove you guys wrong on this one." It is that the design argument now asks not just why do things have limits, but what caused those limits, but why does it have the specific limits it has? So why does this bottle have the specific limits? Why does it have a curve here? Why does it why does it have a round base, and why is it a blue top? Why that particular color was selected? Why? Now, the atheists, like Richard Dawkins, in that book they wrote, The Blind Watchmaker, they posed a very clever argument using logic, and they said that, well, there must be something called this multiverse which pre-exists this universe, and this multiverse randomly creates universes. So it creates an infinite amount of universes. So if you create random universes, an infinite amount of them, then at one point you're bound to get this universe the way it is, or you get this object the way it is. There is a problem with that. There is a big problem with this. Basically, why did the multiverse at one point in time, or one branch of its many universes it creates, why did that particular branch did it cause this particular universe? You still haven't answered the question. All you've said is that there are other universes as well. That's great, but why this particular one? To use an analogy, let's say I have an infinite conveyor belt factory. Let's say, and this conveyor belt produces an infinite amount of random objects. It produces chairs, it produces TVs or mobiles or so on. Okay. Let's say at one instant it produces a chair. At one instant it produces a chair. Question, why is it at that instant it produced a chair? Why not at that instant it didn't decide to produce a mobile, for example? The only conclusion is because that something must have caused the factory to make that chair at that particular point in time. So the multiverse theory collapses because you still haven't answered the question why the particular limitations that this universe has, the particular design of this universe, why does it have that particular design? And so again, the only conclusion is that the infinite force, and again the atheists have to call the multiverse infinite as well. They have to use the word infinite, the atheists as well. This particular universe was caused because whatever created this universe decided to make this universe in the limitations it has, the particular limitations it has. Why is top blue? Because some guy decided this top was going to be blue. Or why is a rock a certain shape? Because when it was formed from the magma on the earth, or when it was hit from a meteorite from above, all its events happened to it caused it to have that particular shape. So the only conclusion we can come is that the universe was shaped according to a particular design, which can only be explained by the driving force of a will. And that's the only that's the second argument for why this infinite thing has a will. So then, now what have we concluded? Coming to the end of my presentation, what have we concluded? That there exists an infinite force. This infinite force is the cause of everything. This infinite force is infinite, has no limitations, and hence requires nothing to define itself. It is uncaused. And we can conclude that it also has a will, because it does not have to create us, it did. And it defines us in a certain way. And the only way we can explain that our particular way that we are defined, the particular way that the constant of light is a particular way, the constant of gravity is a particular way, is because this thing decided it to be so. And that's just rational. I don't have to read any books. I don't have to go to any types of books to or say my book says so that's why I believe it. No, pure rational deduction, pure and simple. But I will end on one verse of the Quran. It is Surah 3, Ayat 190, which says, "Observe in the origination of what is beyond the heaven and the earth itself, and in the alternation of the phases of lightness and dark. These are evidences for people of albab." Albab means perception, mind, and understanding in the Arabic, which is also the exact definition of rational thinking itself. And inshallah, I think that the merit of the Quran in this is not just because the Quran says so we believe it, but rather the Quran is telling us to observe the universe and come to the conclusion of God's existence by recourse to the evidence which is made evident around us. Thank you.
Take some questions. Yes, sir.
You talked about the causality of it, and I mean that exists within time and depends on our experience. But before the universe was existed, there was no time. So can it be applied before the universe existed? I mean, can we not say there was an infinite progression because we have no experience before the universe?
Sure. 2 points. One is, how do we know that causality requires time? Science has said it, but we haven't. There is no evidence to show that it can't be otherwise. So we're making an assumption, but that's not the argument. Even if you believe in an infinite regress, there is causality there. There is a prerequisite. There exist prerequisites which. So you can, maybe you won't call it time, call it a fifth dimension of progression, but that's still a chain of causality which I've shown cannot exist if you say it's infinite. It has to be finite, otherwise it's impossible that anything could exist in an infinite chain of causality. Anyone else?
Speaking about the finite and the infinite together, how could something that is finite exist within something that is infinite? Because if it was infinite, surely wouldn't it occupy everything? Do you see what I mean? Is that how can something finite take up within its parameters something that is infinite? And doesn't that cancel out it being infinite?
Oh, I totally agree, which is why in the doctrine that I follow, which I guess it's an Islamic doctrine, it's only neutral here, but this doctrine I follow, which is Islamic doctrine, says that we're not in God. And God is not literally everywhere, he's physically or in presence everywhere, although we say that he's omniscient, so he knows everything and he has power over all things, but we are not in him, we're not part of him, we are completely separate from him. In fact, we don't even say that he has a location. We cannot say that he has a location related to us, because that would limit him to the compass points. Any other? Have I explained it that well?
Then does that raise the argument that if you're pointing to a creator, it's an entity beyond our humanity, is there nothing that this entity cannot do? If you're saying this entity is boundless, limitless, then is there a limitation to this entity? Is there something that the entity can do? This God? Because if we describe this God as holy, then we've just put a limit on that God's character.
Sure. Okay, that's a very interesting point. And I'll answer that very simply. Basically, our definition of God, people might argue if we have a conception of God, then haven't we linked to God because we've got a conception of him in our mind? That's also, I think that's part of the related point as well. I say, well, if you look at the words, what we use to describe God, infinite, unlimited, independent, what does that mean? infinite, from the Latin infinis, which means not finite. He is unlimited, which means what? Not limited. Independent, which means not dependent. The only way we can define God is by what he's not. So what we're really saying is God is not us. That's our only definition of God, is by saying he's not us. That's the only way we can define God. So you say that is God limited? What is the unlimited limited? Which is basically, obviously, it's a contradiction, because how can he be limited if he is unlimited? And again, now the logical argument that atheists would put forward is that can God create a rock heavier than he could lift? I've heard this argument. And that's very interesting. Because you say this, but you don't realize what you're saying. When you say that can God create a rock heavier than he can lift, what you're really saying is that when God limits himself, can he still be unlimited? I say no. If God limits himself, if he makes a limit on himself, and he becomes intrinsically limited, then he's not God anymore, is he? So how can he
that's my
be
point,
unlimited? Yeah.
That if you're using argument and logic, then by the very use of the word God is something, you're clearly saying that God is not also something else. So you're actually putting a framework, a limit to God.
No, that's only according to the human conception. According to how we think about things, when we describe something, we say that it can't be its opposite. Right? That's a human conception, but the actual description of God is what? He's not finite. You say, oh, you're limiting God when you're saying he's not finite, or he's not limited. It's actually a word game, and it's only because of the limitation of the human mind that we feel that we are boxing God into a
This
category.
is why I say it's a bit of it's a downfall to try and just prove God from logic, because logic in itself is based in a human framework of understanding.
Look, that's why I don't use logic. I use rational thought. And the reason why is because, remember, the only way we can define God is by what he is not. It's very simple. That's the only way we can define God. I'm not giving it away. They call it negative theology, which is essentially you're not positing God with something that is intrinsically he can't change. You are saying that he is not something that is limited. You're saying that he is not something that he's not. That's the only way we can define him. So we haven't boxed God off at all whatsoever. Because if I said that God, it is impossible for God to lie. Let's just put it like this. It's impossible for God to lie. He can't do it, even if he wanted to. Then you're right. I see your point. Then you're right if I said that. But I don't say that. I say God is not finite. He's not limited. And I am not boxing him off at all, because I have not posited to him a limitation at all. I have not boxed him off at all. In fact, I've taken out all the boxes when describing God. But now to answer that further point, I know people might say, how do we know if God is described as holy in our books and he's described as truthful? How do we know this and so on? Or is that not limiting him? I think is the question. Whether God wills to do something or not is his choice. If he wills not to lie, and he says, I'm not going to lie, then he's not limited. He's just chosen not to do it. You know, and this reminds me of a hadith or a narration by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I think it's hadith Qudsi, which says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I have forbidden injustice upon myself. I've forbidden it. I've forbidden upon myself to do injustice. So he's decided not to be unjust. But does that mean he's intrinsically limited? No. No. He just decided not to do something which is unjust. And how do we know he's not lying to us? Is another argument, which inshallah I can bring up another time. But I want to get more questions from the audience.
Any questions from the sisters? Any more questions? Okay, if you have any questions, inshallah, the brother will be here to ask them. And please show your appreciation for putting your hands together. And thank you, brother. Yes,
We say that God is, let's say, advising us not to think to prove his existence, because I think of a hadith, I don't know, I translate it. يأتي أحدكم الشيطان فيقول له من خلق كذا فيقول الله فيقول من خلق كذا فيقول الله فيقول من خلق الله فعليه أن يكذب. So does this mean that we are not equipped with tools that we can exist, and we can't go on to debates?
Well, if that's the case, then why did the Prophet Muhammad debate with a Bedouin When the Bedouin was an atheist, he said, I don't believe God exists. And then he said, the Prophet Muhammad said to the Bedouin, when you are in the desert, you see hoof prints on the sand. What do you conclude from this? And he says, well, there's been a camel. There's been a camel that's probably walked there, even though the Bedouin hasn't seen the camel, but he's detected the camel's hoof prints. And then the Prophet Muhammad said, look up at the sky, you see the stars? These are the footprints of Allah, not in the literal sense, but in the metaphorical analogy. And the Bedouin just said, he testified that God existed because he saw causality. You see, the Prophet Muhammad, that was his manhaj. And the Quran itself is saying that this is everything is all ayat. It is all the signs of God, the evidence of God's existence around us is the universe around us. So I think the Quran is telling us to do the opposite, which is to think about things. The only thing that Islam tells, and I'm going to be very specific about Islam here, the only thing that Islam tells us not to do is to speculate about God's quote-unquote personality. To say things about God that you have no evidence for. You just make it up. You just say, I think God's like this, or I think God exists in the Trinity, or whatever. Where's your proof of this? Where's your evidence for this? And so on. Or I think there are many gods. There's Shiva, Vishnu, and Krishna, and Brahma, and they've created many other sub-gods called Ganesha and what have you. And that's my belief. You say, okay, where's your proof of this? Where have you obtained the proof of this? You just speculate, made it up, felt like saying that. Your ancestors probably told you this. And that's it. That's what Islam prohibits. And that's what you see in the Quran. It says, do you say something about Allah which you do not know? Many times in the Quran. So that is the only prohibition. To give positive attributes, going back to your question, to give positive attributes to God that we don't have reference for. Whereas the only thing we can conclude without revelation is the negative descriptions, as in God is not us, He is not finite, He's not limited, He's not dependent. That's all we can say, and He has a will. That's all we can say.
Any more questions? I would like to thank Brother Abdullah and all of you as well for taking part in this event. Please show your appreciation for Brother Abdullah.